Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I would like to talk tonight about democracy and autocracy. For democracy to work, that is, a government of the people, for the people, and by the people themselves must be educated and they must be diligent in holding those in positions of power and authority to account. This is core to the system, a core requirement to the system. It cannot work without that requirement. And I think this is something that the Greeks themselves, 2,500 years ago, realized and appreciated. And that is why you find they had freedom of expression, freedom of association. They need, as those were the vehicles through which people can be educated and be allowed to participate. Zimbabwe is not a democracy. Zimbabwe is an autocracy. And an autocratic regime is where one individual exercises absolute power. And for an autocratic government to work, the people, the populace, are generally brainwashed so that they ignore reality, the truth, facts, and become obsessed by trivia and shadow boxing. This theme is run through again and again in Zimbabwe. You will find people becoming obsessed about things like sanctions. And they blame sanctions for the country's economic meltdown. And yet they ignore all the overwhelming mountain of evidence showing that it is not sanctions, it is bad governance, corruption that are the root causes. And yet the temptation to switch back to trivial and shadow boxing sometimes is overwhelming. There's been a video that has been circulating in my group, and people have been giving feedback on it, and you can tell from the reaction of it that there are some people who fall for that propaganda. And we need to address this by confronting it, by giving rebuttals to those propaganda videos. So I would like to play this video. Just listen to this.
Continue this morning with the discussion that we've been having around not only ESCOM but SOEs in general, the state of the country's state-owned entities, including ESCOM, SAA, Denel, continuing to deteriorate. Corruption and mismanagement being cited as the leading causes of the fall of these entities. Let's bring in independent analyst Rutendo Martin-Yadare, who believes that South Africa can learn lessons from neighboring Zimbabwe insofar as SOEs here in the country are concerned. Rutendo, let me thank you for your time this morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for coming into studio. And you've penned quite an interesting article that talks about the lessons that South Africa can learn insofar as SOEs are concerned, and Zimbabwe's Zisco Steel. Tell us some of the sort of key findings you've come up with.
Right. Thank you so much for the opportunity. For me, what I've realized is that many people in Africa don't yet understand how the world works. It's a race for resources, and capitalism is about captivating and capturing resources in order to build monopolies. And so what we saw with Zisco Steel was sabotage of Zisco Steel by monopoly makers. And these monopoly makers were companies like Anglo America, ISCO of South Africa, Lancaster Steel, and Boost Alpine, that was manufacturing the machines that we used in smelting iron and steel in Zimbabwe. Now, Zisco Steel is in many ways very similar to Eskom. Zisco Steel was the biggest steel and iron manufacturer in the Southern Hemisphere, the biggest in Africa, the biggest in Brazil, Australia. And what the problem was when we got independence, the Western world was not happy to bestow an African country with the ability to produce iron and the ability to sophisticate iron and to create military hardware and industrial hardware that would have industrialized Zimbabwe or Africa. The reason being, once the Second World War ended, there was a plan called the Morgenthau Plan. The Morgenthau Plan was supposed to deindustrialize Japan and Germany so that they would never rise to become superpowers that would challenge the Western world or the Western banking system. So what they did is they wanted to turn them into agrarian societies, take out their industry, block their mines, take their workers that were most technical and take them out of Germany and out of Japan so that these countries could never rise to industrialize. Eventually what happened is Germany's lack of development, Japan's lack of development made it difficult for the West to compete with Russia. It made it difficult for the West to compete with Russia, which was now bringing communism. So they were forced to allow Germany and Japan to develop so that Western capitalism could show as an example in these regions as a success. But for this Western capitalism to take place, for the Marshall Plan to be given to these Western countries to rise themselves up, they needed cheap resources. So what did they have to do? They had to now take the Morgenthau Plan, this underdevelopment plan, this agrarian society plan to Africa. And so that meant that they had to deindustrialize African countries that had just come out of colonialism to ensure that they'll never be able to sophisticate their resources so that those resources will be passed on.
So keep African countries sort of under your thumb.
Correct.
So that you can use them to your benefit.
And this is exactly what's happening here in South Africa with Eskom. Because you have to understand that Eskom itself was created by a private monopoly that was led.
There's no point in listening to this any further. The point has been made, and we need to address it. It is lamentable that we keep looking for somebody else to blame for our failures. The gentleman talked about Japan and Germany after the Second World War. I think the emergency of Germany and Japan to become industrialized countries, competing in many ways with the rest of the other Western countries. The reason for it can be found in their own history. Japan and Germany, before the Second World War, were leading industrialized countries in their own right. And that has got to do with their ingenuity and good management and focus on issues that needs to be focused on. So it's not as if to say the post Second World War period allowed these two countries to develop out of nothing. They were developed countries already before the second, and that was what made them so powerful during the first and second, during the Second World War. So in this particular case, That was the reason. And I think this idea that somehow the Americans, the British, and the rest of the allies tried to come up with this plan to keep Germany and Japan poor is far-fetched. And the same is now being applied to Africa and Zimbabwe in particular. This is ridiculous. Post independence, Cisco Steel, just like many other parastatals in Zimbabwe, including ZESA, NRZ, started on a downward decline because ZANU-PF appointed managers to run those parastatals, not on the basis of their individuals' competence, but for political reasons, political patronage. Their loyalty to Mugabe and his idea of absolute rule, absolute power, were paramount. And therefore, the decline of these parastatals was inevitable. And instead of addressing those problems, we keep being told, no, it had nothing to do, it was the West who planned this. It's tragic. Because as long as we keep focusing on outsiders and not address the problems that we ourselves have made, I think we'll keep on going round and round in circles here, and absolutely getting nowhere. And it is a pity that people like my friend here are the ones who are actually deliberately misleading the people. This reminds me of George Orwell's book Animal Farm, where the people, the animals, the simple-minded animals, were brainwashed to the point where you'd hear cows drinking water and saying, how good this water tastes, thanks to Comrade Napoleon. Of course, Napoleon had done nothing to deserve that praise, but that becomes the typical mentality, where you forget the reality and start focusing on trivial issues. And in Animal Farm, Napoleon and the fellow pigs started creating these stories of the farmer Jones, or the deposed other pig that was deposed Snowball, or some of the neighboring farmers, always plotting to come back to raid Animal Farm. And so the animals were continuously fighting this imaginary enemy, and creating all these stories to elevate the leaders to nauseating heights, which is, of course, totally meaningless. And this is at the heart of our problem. Right now, Zimbabwe is in the middle of an election. If that election was going to be free, fair, and credible, it will give the country the opportunity to remove the mediocre regime that we have, the corrupt and incompetent regime that we've had since independence. But, of course, these elections are not going to be free, fair, and credible, are they? We can't even produce a verified voters roll. And instead of focusing on that, my friend here is trying to divert our attention and keep up the pretense that our problem is foreigners, it's the West. And until we wake up to that reality, I honestly think we have got a serious problem. Zimbabwe is not going to uh, snap out of this without fighting for meaningful change. That is a fact. And I think it's something that we should seriously think about. Thank you and good night.